Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into week 4 of Biblical Counseling 101, and our focus is squarely on godly roles and relationships. If you've spent, any time at all in ministry, counseling, or honestly just trying to navigate your own family dynamics, you know that the roles we play, whether we're leading, learning, helping, or holding authority, carry a ton of weight. But how are we actually inhabiting those roles? Are we genuinely using them to serve others, or are we kind of secretly using them to serve ourselves? That's the exact tension we're going to unravel today. Okay, let's dive into this. The whole foundation of our explainer today is built on this one incredibly powerful premise from the curriculum. The aim this week is to inhabit relational roles as servants under Christ rather than small sovereigns over others. I really want you to let that sink in for a second. A small sovereign. Man, what an evocative phrase, right? It forces us to ask ourselves, am I ruling my relationships? Am I demanding that my needs get met, my voice gets heard, and my comfort is the top priority? Or am I truly serving within them? Our goal here isn't just to gather more facts, it's to actually let Scripture fundamentally flip the way we see God, ourselves, and the person sitting right across from us. Now, to really get this, we've got to recognize the cultural water we're swimming in. The worldly therapeutic ideal absolutely prizes what pop psychology calls unconditional positive regard. And yeah, sure, offering total acceptance sounds amazing on the surface, but that framework is almost entirely focused on personal rights, boosting self-esteem, and avoiding any real demand for personal change. It basically whispers, hey, I'm fine, you're fine, and any sort of correction is basically an attack. But the scriptural frame, it flips this entirely on its head. Pulling right from Ephesians 5, Philippians 2, and Mark 10, it swaps out that obsession with personal rights for a deep reference for Christ. It calls us to mutual submission. It calls us to serve with the self-giving love of Jesus, which literally redefines what power and authority even mean. It is a completely different operating system for how human beings connect. And that brings us perfectly to the scriptural anchor for all of this. Right before the Apostle Paul hands out any specific roles for marriage or family or the workplace in Ephesians 5 and 6, he drops this absolute game changer of a verse, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Think about that. He completely reframes the entire arena. He's not passing out some corporate org chart or a bill of rights. He's establishing that way before you are a husband, a wife, a parent, a kid, a boss, or an employee, you are a worshiper. Every single relationship you have is primarily a theater to display the self-giving love of Christ. So the core question completely shifts from, well, what am I owed here, to whom am I serving here? Grasping the logic of Scripture here is absolutely crucial, because the gospel has a very specific rhythm for how change happens. We see this beautifully in both Ephesians and Philippians 2. Step 1 is always seeing what God has done. Then step 2 is the indicative, meaning knowing exactly who you are because of what he did. You're chosen, you're forgiven, you were brought near. And only then do we actually get to step 3, the imperative, which is how we're supposed to act. Scripture always grounds our identity in God's grace way before it ever gives us a to-do list. If we flip that order around in our counseling or even in our own relationships, we just end up running on fumes, relying on sheer willpower and moralism instead of the actual transforming power of the gospel. And that leads to this massive paradigm shift that David Polison champions in the readings for this week. He calls it renewed sight. Look, too often we treat the Bible like it's a cosmic vending machine, right? We think, oh, this person is feeling anxious? Let me just type in D4 and drop a little Philippians 4:6 on them. But that is incredibly shallow, and let's be real, half the time the verse gets stuck anyway. Renewed sight means we aren't just copy-pasting a fragmented verse onto a problem. Instead, we are using the whole of Scripture as a lens to interpret people before God. We have to stand under the text ourselves until it changes how we see things. That way, our counsel is shaped by living, breathing faith, not just borrowed religious catchphrases. So the crucial point is this idea of vertical before horizontal. When we start looking at our relationships through this lens of renewed sight, it hits us that relational breakdown is almost never just horizontal. It's never strictly about who left the dishes in the sink for 3 days or who completely dropped the ball on that ministry project. Underneath the friction between two people, there is always a vertical question of worship. Who or what is each person actually serving in that exact moment? If we only try to smooth out the horizontal conflict without ever touching on the vertical worship of the heart, we're literally just putting band-aids on broken bones. To really make this concrete, let's look at how this functional worship plays out in our everyday lives. It's wild how good, perfectly natural desires can so easily twist into those small monarchies we talked about earlier. Like a totally fine desire to be heard mutates into this rigid demand that you must never be interrupted. Or the natural desire for safety, it turns into a demand for absolute zero risk. Even the noble desire to help someone out can secretly warp into a demand that they change on your exact timeline. The second those desires become demands, we aren't serving under Christ anymore. We're just acting like small, demanding sovereigns over everybody around us. Let's apply this to a real-world scenario from the curriculum. Consider this case vignette we'll call approval hunger. So we have this ministry trainee, and she feels incredibly spiritually alive whenever she gets praised. But she feels practically abandoned by God the second she goes unnoticed. The really fascinating thing here is that she knows all the right theology. She can flawlessly explain the doctrine of grace, and yet functionally, she is living as though visibility, relational approval, and human praise are her actual oxygen. The truth is super accurate in her mouth, but it stays incredibly thin in her actual affections. This case study really forces us to pause and ponder a super vital question. What happens when a good desire becomes necessary? Look, wanting to do a good job, wanting your hard work to get a little nod of acknowledgement, those are perfectly fine desires. But for this trainee, that desire has morphed into an absolute necessity for her very spiritual survival. We have to ask, what fears, what hidden refuges, what functional picture of God is actually driving this? If we are going to offer wise care, we can't just slap her on the wrist and say, stop wanting approval. We have to help her uncover what she's actually trusting in when God seems just a little too quiet or hidden. So how in the world do we guide someone through that? Well, here is the 5-step movement of wise, scripture-shaped care. I want you to notice what sits right at the very beginning. Listen. Then clarify. Only after that do we interpret, speak, and practice. Look, firing off an answer before you've humbly listened to someone isn't just unhelpful, it's foolish. If we rush straight to interpretation just because we think we've got them all figured out, we are reducing a beautiful, image-bearing neighbor to nothing more than a manageable project. True listening is an intentional refusal to make another person small enough to manage quickly. We absolutely must receive the person before we ever offer an answer. And this brilliantly illustrates how easily we can deceive ourselves, even when we're the ones sitting in the counselor's seat. We have these relational chairs we like to sit in, and it's crazy how we can use perfectly good roles just for our own self-protection. Like, you can totally use the helper chair to aggressively avoid ever needing help yourself. You can set up shop in the wounded chair so you forever avoid taking any real responsibility. You can be the perpetual learner who just gathers endless info to hide from actual obedience. Or you can use the authority chair to completely dodge vulnerability. Christ doesn't just reorder which chair we sit in, he totally transforms how we sit there. The real danger here is that counselors can become highly sophisticated defenders. Honestly, we're so good at hiding. Ever since sin entered the picture, hiding has basically been an art form. As helpers, we might defend a really harsh interpretation by just burying the person in extra words. We might defend our own basic human exhaustion by dressing it up in fancy, spiritual ministry language. Or we might mask our own deep insecurities by playing the untouchable expert in the room. Defensiveness is so often just shame wearing a suit of armor and calling itself wisdom. We've really got to pay attention to our own bodily cues of defensiveness. You know, the heat in your face, the speed of your words, that urgent, desperate need to be understood before you even try to understand the other person. Which brings us right to a vital, totally non-negotiable warning from the curriculum. I want you to read this pastoral caution really carefully. Do not confuse having a role with inhabiting that role redemptively. Just because you hold the title of counselor or pastor or parent or leader, it absolutely does not mean you are automatically acting as a servant under Christ. It is entirely possible to hold a beautiful God-given role and completely abuse the power that comes with it just to protect yourself or control someone else. Inhabiting a role redemptively, that requires a relentless, everyday posture of relational humility. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how deeply challenging this whole framework is, because it doesn't just let us leave these things as abstract academic concepts. It demands that we bring the truth home to our own hearts first. This weekly heart prompt asks a really piercing question. Where do I use my role to avoid humility, service, or mutual submission before Christ? Biblical counseling only becomes wise when it actually passes through the filter of our own prayer and our own obedience. The Lord literally teaches us how to counsel by counseling us first. We've got to spot that giant log in our own eye before we start trying to delicately tweeze the speck out of our neighbors. So I want to end our explainer today by leaving you with a really provocative question to just sit with. Which relational chair do you use to avoid dependence, confession,
patience, or humble service? Are you secretly hiding behind the mask of the helper, the learner, or the authority? I really encourage you to take a few quiet moments with this question today. Let the light of the gospel search out those corners of your own heart so that the next time you turn to help someone else, you do it not as some small, demanding sovereign, but as a true fellow servant under Christ. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer today. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and keep serving.